Right, as we saw in New Mexico, the Californios would also lose a large amount of their land. As more and more Anglo-Americans arrive into California, they may participate in the gold rush at first, but eventually, after the gold rush starts to die down, they'll start focusing on obtaining lands in California. So you'll have a number of squatters basically setting up their homes on lands that didn't belong to them. And so basically in the United States at this time, there's a law that had been passed called the Preemption Act of 1841. And the Preemption Act established that in all of these Western territories, that Americans, if they had occupied an area for 5 years and they have made improvements on the land, they have to make certain improvements on the land. That's pretty much talking about like farming or developing agriculture on that land. If they do that for 5 years, then they could buy 160 acres of that land. And so this basically opens up the West to Americans who are migrating from the East during this time. And so you'll have a number of squatters in California trying to use this Preemption Act to their advantage. They'll be setting up shop on lands. Sometimes these are lands owned by Mexican Americans, part of the large ranchos that existed in California during this time, and they'll be setting up their homes there and starting to work that land. Now, the thing that pretty much reinforces the rights of these squatters is going to be the Federal Land Grant Act of 1851. Now, the Land Grant Act is basically violating the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Why? Because in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the rights, in particular property rights, of Mexican Americans were to be respected. But the Land Grant Act made it to where Mexican Americans had to prove that they had legal title to that land. They had to go to court in front of a commission and prove that they had legal documentation and that these lands were actually theirs, and many of them did. So let's take a look at that, a little closer look at this court system and how it was used to take lands from Mexican Americans in California. And so the Land Grant Act established the Board of Land Commissioners. These are three individuals who were on this board, and basically all Mexican Americans who had lands had to travel to San Francisco and go in front of this board and prove that they had legal rights to these lands. Now, there's a number of reasons why Mexican Americans eventually lost these lands. So first of all, many of them didn't have actual legal documentation that proved that they had rights to those lands. If some did, sometimes the documentation was very basic. It could have just been like a sketch of the territory that they owned. Oftentimes they didn't have actual boundaries to their ranches, like, real physical boundaries. Sometimes it may have been very obscure things like, okay, my territory ends at this pile of rocks or in this certain area. So it's really hard to determine in the Anglo-American system that these lands actually belonged to these Mexican Americans, right? Because under the Mexican system and the earlier Spanish system, those land grants were totally valid. They didn't require actual legal documentation or specific boundaries to where the territory ended. Okay. Another thing that led to the loss of land was that Mexican Americans had 2 years. Right after the federal land grant was passed, you have 2 years to submit your claims to that land. Now, if you aren't aware that this land grant had been passed, then those 2 years could pass and you can lose your land. So if you don't submit your claim in 2 years, you would lose your land. Another reason for the loss of land was the cost of legal fees, particularly the cost of lawyers. So many Mexican Americans had to take out loans just to pay their legal fees, right, to these lawyers. And sometimes it came to the point where they had to pay their lawyers with some of their land. So they would lose their land just paying for legal fees. Another big cost in all of this was the cost of appeals, because a lot of these cases that went before the Board of Land Commissioners would eventually get appealed, right? A huge number of them got appealed, and they could be appealed several times, all the way up to the Supreme Court. The average court case lasted for about 17 years. 17 years of litigation. And that's a very long time to be paying lawyers' fees and court fees and traveling up to San Francisco. All of that costs a lot of money. And so all of these costs eventually would lead to the loss of land for many Mexican Americans, right? Because sometimes they're just giving the land to their lawyers because that's how they're paying them because they don't have the actual money. Other times they would just have to sell off their lands because they went bankrupt because of all of these years of litigation. Now, as I said earlier, the large portion of the Mexican-American population was in Southern California. And in Southern California, that's where you had a thriving cattle industry during the Mexican period in California. But eventually, the cattle industry that was dominated by Mexican-Americans in Southern California would come to an end. And there's several reasons why it came to an end. One, you had other cattle ranchers who began bringing in cattle and sheep from the East and Midwest. They would make their way to California, and they became a source of competition for the Mexican Americans who were involved in the cattle industry there. Also, you had in the 1860s a series of natural disasters that led to the downfall of the cattle industry. First, you had heavy flooding from 1861 to 1862. These floods would disrupt the cattle industry, and then after that, you had a couple years of drought. Right, 1863 to 1864, and with this drought, there's no rainfall, and without the rainfall, there are no fields growing for the cattle to graze on, and so a large percentage of the cattle in Southern California died of starvation because of this drought. Okay. Other reasons for the downfall of the cattle industry in Southern California were that the owners of land were having to pay high interest rates on loans at this time, and also in some cases they were paying high property taxes. And so ultimately, because of these economic issues, bad business decisions, and a series of natural disasters, you see the cattle industry going under in Southern California. Eventually, it would be replaced by the agricultural industry in California. So you would see a lot of those lands, which were once ranch lands, becoming agricultural lands, right? Used to grow crops instead of raising cattle. And so as the ranching industry starts to go into decline, you'll have a number of Mexican Americans who worked on those ranches moving from the more rural areas to the cities. So there's a large migration of Mexican Americans moving to the cities like Los Angeles and Southern California as the cattle industry goes into decline.